Imagine waking up to the sound of hoofbeats. Not just a few horses, thousands of them, shaking the earth beneath your city walls. You've heard the stories. Entire cities erased from existence. Rivers running red for days. Pyramids built from human skulls. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. The horsemen outside your walls? They're not even the worst part of living in the 13th century. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why being born during the age of Genghis Khan meant facing a level of horror that makes modern warfare look merciful. We're talking about an empire that killed so many people, it actually cooled the planet. And that's just the beginning. But there's something even more terrifying that historians rarely discuss, something that happened to the survivors. We'll get to that in about 45 minutes. And trust me, you won't see it coming. For now, let's start with a simple question. What was it actually like to be an ordinary person when the most successful conqueror in human history decided your city was next? Life in 1200 AD. The calm. Before the storm. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1200. Genghis Khan isn't even Genghis Khan yet. He's still Temujin, a nobody trying to unite the Mongol tribes. You're living in one of the great civilizations of the era. Maybe you're in the Khwarezmian Empire, in a bustling city like Samarkand. Maybe you're a Chinese farmer in the Ghen dynasty. Or perhaps you're in Eastern Europe, completely unaware that your entire world is about to change. Your life isn't easy. Life in 1200 never is. But it's predictable. You wake up, you work, you pray, you sleep. Your biggest concerns are the harvest, local bandits, maybe a dispute with a neighbor over land. War exists, sure, but it's usually between kingdoms you barely understand, fought by soldiers who might pillage your village but will probably just pass through. You have no concept of total war. No understanding of what's about to emerge from the Mongolian steppes. The steppe culture, forging the ultimate warriors. Meanwhile, on the vast grasslands of Mongolia, an entire culture is being shaped by one of the harshest environments on Earth. Let me paint you a picture of Mongol childhood, because it explains everything that comes later. Mongol children learn to ride horses before they can properly walk. By age 3, they're on horseback. By 5, they're learning to shoot arrows at full gallop. Their toys? Miniature bows. Their games? Mock battles that would give modern parents heart attacks. But here's the thing, this isn't just cultural, it's survival. The Mongolian steppe doesn't forgive weakness. Winters drop to -40 degrees. Summers scorch the grasslands. Food is never guaranteed. You follow the herds, or you die. You learn to fight, or you die. You adapt to constant movement, or you die. Every single Mongol warrior who will eventually sweep across Asia has been hardened by this environment since birth. They can survive on almost nothing, sometimes just horse blood and fermented mare's milk for days. They can ride for 18 hours straight. They can shoot accurately backwards while retreating at full speed. Now imagine you're a city dweller. You've never ridden a horse in your life. You've never gone a day without eating. You've certainly never trained for combat since childhood. You see where this is going. The rise of Temujin, birth of a monster. In 1162, Temujin is born clutching a blood clot in his fist, an omen, the shamans say, that he will be a great warrior. His childhood is brutal even by Mongol standards. His father is poisoned when Temujin is 9. His family is abandoned by their tribe, left to starve. His half-brother tries to dominate the family, so Temujin murders him. He's captured by a rival tribe and enslaved with a wooden collar around his neck. Most people broken by this would stay broken. Temujin, he escapes, starts building alliances, and begins his climb to power. By 1206, he's united the Mongol tribes, something no one has ever done before, and takes the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Now here's the question that'll make sense by the end of this section. Why did the Mongols succeed where every other steppe confederation failed? It wasn't just their riding skills or their toughness. Genghis Khan invented something that changed warfare forever: And if you were alive during his conquests, this innovation would be the thing that sealed your fate. We'll reveal exactly what that was in just a moment. The innovation that changed everything. Genghis Khan's secret weapon wasn't actually a weapon at all. It was organization. Before Genghis Khan, armies were basically mobs. Noble birth determined command. Soldiers fought in loose formations based on tribal or family loyalties. It was chaos that occasionally won battles through sheer numbers or individual heroism. Genghis Khan destroyed this system. He organized his army in groups of 10. 10 men formed a squad. 10 squads formed a company of 100. 10 companies formed a battalion of 1,000. 10 battalions formed a division of 10,000. Every level had a commander chosen purely for merit, not birth. But here's the truly revolutionary part. If one man in your squad of 10 retreated without orders, the entire squad was executed. If one squad broke, the entire company of 100 was executed. This created absolute terrifying discipline. The Mongol army moved like a single organism. They could execute complex maneuvers, fake retreats, pincer movements, coordinated charges from multiple directions, with a precision that seemed supernatural to their enemies. Add to this their communication system. Mongol armies used signal arrows, flags, and drums to coordinate across vast distances. While European and Chinese armies were still figuring out how to send messages, Mongol commanders could reshape their entire battle formation in minutes. And the intelligence network? Before the Mongols attacked, they'd spend months gathering information through merchants, spies, and captured prisoners. They knew the political divisions in your city, which gates were weakest, where the granaries were located, who might betray the rulers for the right price. You weren't facing a horde of barbarians. You were facing the most sophisticated military machine the world had ever seen. The first conquests, testing the system. Between 1207 and 1215, Genghis Khan practices on smaller targets. The Tangut Kingdom. Various Chinese states. Each conquest teaches the Mongols something new. They learn siege warfare from Chinese engineers they capture and keep alive specifically for their expertise. Remember that detail. The Mongols are pragmatic in a way that will become very important later. If you had skills they needed, you might survive. Might. By 1211, they're ready for the big target, the Ghen dynasty of northern China, with a population of over 50 million people and cities protected by walls that seem impregnable. The Ghen court isn't worried. These are steppe nomads. What do they know about taking cities? Everything, as it turns out. The siege begins. Your city's last days. Let's put you in a specific place at a specific time. It's 1220, and you live in Bukhara, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world. A center of learning, trade, and culture. Your city has walls 30 feet high. You have tens of thousands of soldiers. You have food stockpiled for a year-long siege. You've heard the rumors about the Mongols, but they're far away. Your sultan's armies will handle them. Besides, Bukhara has never fallen. It's simply too strong. Then the refugees start arriving. Not a few, thousands. They tell stories that sound impossible. Cities of 100,000 people completely destroyed. Every single person dead. The Mongols don't just defeat armies, they erase them. Your city leaders don't believe it. Propaganda, they say. Exaggeration meant to frighten us. Then the scouts stop returning. The roads go silent. And one morning, you wake up to see smoke on the horizon. The Mongol arrival. Psychological warfare. The Mongols don't just attack. They orchestrate terror. First, they position their army so you can see it from the walls. And here's something that would make your blood run cold. They look infinite. The Mongols have learned to make their forces seem larger by mounting dummies on spare horses. They spread out over the landscape. They light extra campfires at night. Your scouts report 100,000 warriors, maybe 200,000. You can't tell. The actual number is probably 20,000. But you don't know that. Then they send a messenger. His message is always the same. Submit now, and only your soldiers will die. Your city will become part of the empire. You'll pay tribute, but life will continue. Resist, and every living thing inside your walls will be killed. Your leaders debate. Some want to surrender. Others call them cowards. Pride wins. You've never surrendered, and you won't start now. The messenger leaves. The Mongols wait. This is where the psychological torture really begins. They don't attack immediately. They let you watch them. Let you think about what's coming. Days pass, then weeks. Your food supplies dwindle. Tensions rise inside the city. Rumors spread. Maybe they'll just leave, someone says. Maybe they're waiting for reinforcements that will never come. Then one night, you hear it. The sound of construction. By morning, you see what they've built. Massive siege engines, catapults, trebuchets. And here's the thing that would truly terrify you. They were built by Chinese and Persian engineers. Captured specialists forced to turn their expertise against their own people. The siege weapons aren't positioned randomly. They're targeting specific weak points in your walls. Weak points your own engineers thought no one else knew about. Because the Mongols have been interrogating refugees and captured soldiers for weeks, they know everything about your city, every detail, every secret, the assault, when hell comes to earth. Now, let me describe what happens when the Mongols actually attack, because this is where the true horror begins. The bombardment starts at dawn. The siege engines launch stones the size of sheep. But they're not just throwing rocks. Some projectiles are pots of burning naphtha, medieval napalm that splashes fire across everything it touches. Others are rotting animal carcasses meant to spread disease. And in some documented cases, they catapulted prisoners back into cities, living people turned into weapons. The walls crack, sections collapse, and then the Mongol cavalry finds the breaches. Here's where their tactics become truly nightmarish. The first wave is often made up of conscripted soldiers from previously conquered cities, your neighbors basically, forced to attack first. If they retreat, the Mongols kill them. If they advance, your defenders kill them. The Mongols save their own warriors and exhaust your soldiers at the same time. When the real Mongol forces hit, they're fresh and you're tired. Your soldiers fight bravely. They have no choice. But you're facing warriors who've been training since age 3, who can fire arrows with shocking accuracy, who coordinate like they share one mind. The discipline is absolute. When one unit feints a retreat, another swings around your flank. When you reinforce one section of wall, they strike somewhere else. Your army breaks, not because they're cowards, but because they're human. The fall. Hour 0. The moment the city falls is when you realize everything you heard was true. Mongol soldiers pour through the breaches. They're not frenzied or out of control. They're methodical. They've done this before, many times before. First, they secure the granaries and water supplies, strategic points. Then they herd everyone who's still alive into the central square or a large open area. Thousands of people packed together. You're holding your children. Someone nearby is praying. Others are crying. Everyone is terrified. The Mongols separate the population into groups. Artisans and skilled workers to one side. They ask who among you can engineer bridges, forge weapons, work metal, practice medicine. These people are marked and guarded. Everyone else. Here's what I need you to understand. What comes next isn't random violence. It's policy, calculated strategy. Genghis Khan has a rule. Cities that resist are destroyed so completely that they serve as warnings to the next city. And destroyed means something very specific. The aftermath, making examples. I'm going to share the documented historical accounts, but I'm giving you fair warning this is where it gets genuinely difficult to hear. When Bukhara fell in 1220, the Mongols killed an estimated 30,000 people. But the killing wasn't the worst part. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the city's Grand Mosque, one of Islam's holiest sites, and declared it was the stable of God. He used Qurans as feeding troughs for his horses. When Nishapur fell in 1221 after the death of a Mongol prince in battle, the Khan's daughter herself supervised the massacre. Historical sources claim every living thing was killed: humans, dogs, cats, even rats. The city's population, possibly 1.7 million people, was reduced to zero. They built pyramids from the skulls, separate pyramids for men, women, and children. When Merv fell, the largest city in the world at the time, 1.3 million people were systematically executed. The Mongols assigned each soldier a quota, 300-400 people to kill. They checked the bodies afterward to make sure the job was complete. But here's the question that would haunt the survivors of nearby cities. Why would the Mongols do this? Were they just sadistic? The answer is more calculated and, in some ways, more chilling. We'll get to the strategic genius behind the horror in just a moment, because understanding this changes everything about how you'd experience living in this era. The logic of terror. The Mongols weren't psychopaths. They were pragmatists running an empire on a ruthlessly efficient model. Here's the math. A Mongol army might be 20,000 strong, but they're conquering territories with millions of people. How do you control a population that outnumbers you 100 to 1? You can't occupy every city. You don't have the manpower. So you create a choice: surrender immediately and live under our rule, or resist and face literal extinction. Each massacred city was a message. When word spread about what happened to Nishapur or Merv, the next city on the Mongol path faced an impossible decision. And increasingly, cities chose surrender. By 1221, some cities in the Khwarezmian Empire were opening their gates the moment Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon. Not because the people were cowards, but because they'd done the math. They'd heard the stories. They knew the Mongols always kept their promises, both the promise of mercy for surrender and the promise of annihilation for resistance. This is why being born during Genghis Khan's era was so uniquely terrible. You didn't just face the possibility of death in war. You faced a systematic, calculated application of terror as military strategy. Your choices were surrender your freedom and identity or die. There was no third option. And if you think, well, I'd just surrender then, you're about to discover why that wasn't the escape you'd hoped for. Surrender isn't safety. So your city surrenders. The gates open. The Mongol army rides in without a fight. You've made the smart choice, right? You get to live. Let me tell you what living means under Mongol rule. First, they take inventory of everything. Your food stores, your weapons, your valuables, your people. Mongol administrators are shockingly efficient. They've learned record-keeping from conquered Chinese bureaucrats. Then comes the tribute. The Mongols don't just want gold and silver. They want a percentage of everything you produce: grain, livestock, crafted goods. And they want soldiers, your sons, your brothers. They're conscripted into the Mongol army to fight against the next city, to kill their own people. Remember those waves of expendable soldiers I mentioned earlier? Those are from surrendered cities. The Mongols turned conquered populations into weapons against their neighbors. But here's something even more insidious. The Mongols are brilliant at exploiting divisions. Are there tensions between religious groups in your city? Between classes? Between ethnic populations? The Mongols identify these fractures and use them. They elevate one group over another, create rivalries, ensure no unified resistance can form. You're alive, yes. But you're living in a society that's being systematically broken down and rebuilt to serve the empire. The Yasak, Law of the Khan. The Mongol legal code, the Yasak, governs your life now. And some of its rules would seem bizarre to you. Stealing from another citizen? Death. Lying? Death. Adultery? Death. The penalties are harsh, but they're applied equally. Unlike your previous rulers, Mongol law doesn't care about your status or wealth. A nobleman gets the same punishment as a peasant. In a twisted way, this creates stability. Theft drops to almost zero in Mongol-controlled territories because everyone knows the consequences. The roads become safe in a way they haven't been in centuries. Merchants can travel from China to Eastern Europe without being robbed. But there's a catch. Religious freedom is protected. The Mongols don't care what you believe, but political dissent means death. Speak against the Khan? Death. Refuse Mongol authority? Death. Try to leave? Death. You're living in a society that's simultaneously more lawful and more oppressive than anything you've known before. Life in the provinces, the grinding reality. Let's zoom in on daily life in a conquered territory, say 1230. The immediate violence is over. Genghis Khan has died, but his sons and grandsons continue expanding the empire. You're a farmer in northern China. Your village surrendered years ago. You haven't been killed, your home wasn't burned. But here's what your life looks like now. You work your fields, but a third of everything you grow goes to Mongol officials. During harvest season, Mongol tax collectors arrive with their local collaborators, other Chinese who've sided with the occupiers. They count every bushel. If you're short, they take something else. Maybe your ox, maybe your daughter to work in a Mongol household. Your son was conscripted 3 years ago. You don't know if he's alive. He could be fighting in Persia or Eastern Europe, or dead in a ditch somewhere. No one tells you. The Buddhist monastery in the nearby town has protected the Mongols like religious institutions because they keep populations docile. But the local officials who resisted the occupation, their extended families were relocated thousands of miles away, broken up, scattered across the empire so they can never organize. And here's the thing. You can never forget you're occupied. Mongol soldiers patrol the roads. Mongol officials oversee local governance. There are informants everywhere. Your neighbor might report you for a disloyal comment, hoping to reduce his own tax burden. You keep your head down. You work. You pray the Mongols won't notice you, because being noticed is dangerous. The population transfer. Breaking cultural identity. One of the most effective and cruel Mongol strategies was forced relocation. Entire populations were moved thousands of miles from their homelands. Chinese engineers were brought to Persia to build siege weapons. Persian administrators were sent to China to organize tax collection. Russian craftsmen were relocated to Mongolia itself. The goal was twofold: spread useful skills across the empire and destroy cultural cohesion. Imagine being ripped from everything you know. Your ancestral home, your community, your language group. You're marched halfway across Asia to a place where you don't speak the language, don't know the customs, have no family, no support network. You're utterly dependent on Mongol authority for survival. This is social engineering on a massive scale. The Mongols are creating a world where local identity is shattered and the only unifying force is the empire itself. If you were born during this era, you could easily end up dying in a land you'd never heard of, surrounded by people whose language you don't speak, working on projects that benefit an empire you never wanted to join. The disease connection, an unintentional apocalypse. Now let's talk about something the Mongols didn't intend but absolutely caused. They connected the world, and in doing so, they spread diseases across continents. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched from Korea to Hungary. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and they built roads, established way stations, and encouraged trade across this vast distance. Merchants could travel from Europe to China. Information flowed. Goods flowed. And diseases flowed. Bubonic plague had existed in Asia for centuries, but it was localized. The Mongol trade routes gave it a highway to Europe. By the 1340s, just a century after Genghis Khan's death, the Black Death reaches Europe and kills 30–60% of the entire population. This wasn't deliberate genocide, but it was a consequence of Mongol expansion. If you were born in 1250, you might survive the Mongol conquest only to die of plague a few decades later because the empire connected disease pools that had been separate for millennia. Your entire civilization could end not because of horses and arrows, but because of fleas on rats that traveled along roads the Mongols built. The environmental collapse, killing the planet. Here's something truly staggering that modern research has revealed. The Mongol conquest killed so many people that it affected the global climate. Between 1200 and 1380, an estimated 40 million people died as a direct result of Mongol military action. 40 million. In a world with a total population of maybe 400 million. When vast populations died or were displaced, farmland returned to forest. Massive amounts of carbon were pulled from the atmosphere by regrowing vegetation. Scientists analyzing ice cores have found a measurable drop in atmospheric CO2 during this period. The Mongol conquests were so deadly, they cooled the earth. Think about what this means for you as an individual living through this. You're not just witnessing the fall of kingdoms or the death of millions. You're watching the collapse of agricultural civilization across entire regions. Fertile valleys that supported cities for centuries are now silent. Irrigation systems built over generations crumble with no one to maintain them. If you were a survivor, you'd be living in a world that was literally emptier than it had been. Villages you knew were gone. Entire ethnic groups had been wiped out or scattered. The landscape itself had changed. But remember that question I teased at the beginning? The thing that happened to survivors that historians rarely discuss? We're about to get to that, and it explains why even escaping the violence didn't mean escaping the horror. The psychological devastation. Let's talk about trauma in an era before anyone understood PTSD or psychological wounds. You're a survivor of a Mongol conquest. Maybe you were in a city that surrendered. Maybe you hid during a massacre. Maybe you were away when your village was destroyed and came back to find everyone dead. What happens to your mind? Medieval people understood grief, of course. They understood fear. But they'd never experienced anything like this. War in the pre-Mongol era was terrible, but it was comprehensible. Armies fought, one side won, there might be looting and some civilian deaths, and then life resumed. The Mongol conquests were different. They were existential. They erased entire populations. They traumatized on a civilizational scale. Survivors reported nightmares for years. Permanent terror at the sound of hoofbeats. An inability to feel safe. Persian and Chinese sources from this era describe people who simply stopped speaking after witnessing Mongol massacres. They withdrew completely, unable to process what they'd seen. And here's the cruel part. There was no therapy, no counseling, no framework for understanding psychological trauma. You just had to keep living with the horror in your head. Religious communities were overwhelmed with people seeking meaning. How could God allow this? What divine plan could justify such suffering? Some historical sources suggest suicide rates spiked in post-conquest regions. People who'd survived physically couldn't survive mentally. The collaborators' guilt. Here's something even more complex. What happened to people who helped the Mongols? Because there were a lot of them. Translators who helped Mongol administrators. Merchants who provided supplies. Local officials who kept their positions by serving the new overlords. Engineers who built siege weapons. Soldiers from conquered territories who fought for the empire. Some did it to survive. Some did it for opportunity. The Mongols rewarded useful people with wealth and status. Some genuinely believed Mongol rule was better than what came before. But imagine living as a collaborator. Your neighbors know you helped the occupiers. You might be prosperous, protected even, but you're also despised. You sold out your people to save yourself. Chinese sources from this period describe collaborators who became wealthy but couldn't escape the social stigma. They were excluded from community celebrations. Their children couldn't find marriage partners. In some cases, when Mongol power eventually weakened, collaborators were hunted down and killed by their own people decades after the initial conquest. You could survive the Mongols, even prosper under them, but never escape the guilt and hatred that came with collaboration. The generational trauma. Children of conquest. Now, let's talk about the children born during and after the conquests. This is the part of the story that often gets overlooked. If you were born in 1235, you never knew the pre-Mongol world. Your parents' stories about the old kingdoms, the old ways, the time before the empire, it all sounds mythical to you. You've only ever known Mongol rule. But you've also grown up surrounded by trauma. Your mother flinches at loud sounds. Your father wakes screaming from nightmares. Your grandmother won't talk about what happened when she was young. The adults around you carry invisible wounds that affect how they raise you. Maybe your city is half empty because so many people died. Maybe you play in the ruins of buildings that were destroyed before you were born. Maybe you've seen the skull pyramids that still stand as warnings. You're being shaped by violence you didn't experience directly, but that haunts your entire world. And here's something particularly cruel. The Mongols used children of conquered people as hostages and recruits. Boys as young as 10 might be taken from their families and raised in Mongol camps, trained to be warriors, taught to identify with the empire rather than their birth culture. These children grew up between worlds, too Mongolized to fit in with their original people, but never fully trusted by the Mongols because of their blood. They were tools, caught between two identities, belonging fully to neither. The resistance that couldn't win. Despite everything, people resisted. Of course they did. Humans don't just accept subjugation. But resistance in the Mongol era was uniquely hopeless. When a city rebelled, the Mongols would return with overwhelming force and annihilate it. When guerrilla fighters attacked supply lines, the Mongols would depopulate entire regions to eliminate the support base. When leaders emerged, the Mongols would offer massive rewards for their betrayal, rewards large enough that someone always collected. The empire had the resources, the military superiority, and the ruthless will to crush any opposition. And they had time. They could afford to wait out resistance, starve out holdouts, systematically eliminate any threat. There are stories of incredible bravery. The siege of Xiangyang, where Chinese defenders held out for 5 years. The last stand at Baghdad, where the caliphate made its final defense. The Russian princes who kept fighting even as their lands burned. But they all lost in the end. Every single resistance movement failed. If you were born during this era and wanted to fight back, you weren't just facing death, you were facing meaningless death. Death that wouldn't change anything, that wouldn't inspire others, that would just result in more horror for your community. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they conquered hope itself. The cultural extinction. Here's something that would haunt you if you were a scholar or artist during this time. Watching your culture die. The Mongols weren't particularly interested in destroying culture for its own sake. They were pragmatic, not ideological. But the sheer scale of death meant that cultural knowledge was lost. Libraries burned. Not because the Mongols hated books, but because they happened to be in buildings that were being destroyed. Scholars died. Not because they were targeted, but because they were in cities that were massacred. Oral traditions ended because entire communities were wiped out. The Khwarezmian Empire had a rich literary and scientific tradition. Most of it was lost in the Mongol conquests. The Song dynasty had achieved remarkable technological and artistic heights. Much of that was destroyed or scattered. The Islamic Golden Age was in full flower. Baghdad's libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, the Tigris River ran black with ink from the destroyed books. If you were an educated person during this era, you'd be watching the accumulated knowledge of centuries disappear, and you'd be powerless to stop it. Some scholars tried to preserve what they could. They hid manuscripts, memorized texts, fled to regions not yet conquered. But it was like trying to save water in a sieve. Too much was lost too quickly. Your civilization's achievements, your people's history, your culture's identity, all of it could vanish in a single generation. The women's experience, a special horror. We need to talk specifically about what it meant to be a woman during the Mongol conquests. The Mongol policy on conquered women was systematic and brutal. Young women were regularly taken as war booty, distributed among soldiers, or sent back to Mongolia as slaves. Historical sources suggest that Mongol soldiers considered women part of the plunder, no different from gold or livestock. If your city was conquered and you were a young woman, your chances of rape were essentially 100%. If you survived, you might be forced to marry a Mongol soldier. Or you might be sold. Or you might be worked to death as a servant. Some women killed themselves rather than face this fate. Persian sources describe women throwing themselves from city walls as the Mongols breached the defenses. Others killed their daughters to spare them. But here's an even more complex horror. Some women who were taken eventually had children with their captors. These children were technically Mongol by blood, but born from violence and trauma. The women faced an impossible situation loving children born from rape, raising kids who embodied their trauma, trying to protect them in a hostile world. And in some cases, women from conquered territories actually gained influence by becoming wives or concubines of Mongol leaders. Mongol women had more rights than women in many conquered societies, and some adopted conquered women brought elements of their culture into the imperial system. But that's cold comfort. Whatever limited opportunity existed came only through complete submission and loss of everything you'd known. The genetic legacy. Modern genetic studies have revealed something staggering. Approximately 16 million men alive today, about 0.5% of the world's male population, carry a Y chromosome lineage that originated in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago. One particular lineage is so widespread that geneticists believe it came from Genghis Khan himself and his close male relatives. Through conquest and the systematic impregnation of women across Asia, his genetic line spread like a biological empire. If you were a woman during the Mongol conquests, there was a very real chance your children or grandchildren would carry the DNA of your conquerors. The violence wasn't just happening to your generation. It was literally being written into the genetic future of your family line. This is conquest at the most fundamental level. Not just taking land or resources, but reshaping the human population itself. The empire transforms. By 1260, the Mongol Empire has fractured into 4 khanates. Genghis Khan's grandsons rule different regions. The era of rapid conquest is slowing. The empire is transitioning from military expansion to administrative consolidation. If you're living during this period, life becomes strange. The violence decreases. The Mongol rulers become more interested in tax revenue than terror. In some regions, they start adopting local customs. The Ilkhanate in Persia converts to Islam. The Yuan dynasty in China takes on Chinese characteristics. Kublai Khan builds a Chinese-style capital in Khanbalik, modern Beijing. On the surface, it looks like normalization. The empire is becoming just another political system. But underneath, the trauma remains. Entire generations have grown up under occupation. The old kingdoms are gone, their ruling class is dead or scattered, their cultural institutions disrupted or destroyed. You're living in a post-apocalyptic world that's trying to pretend everything is normal. And here's the thing. The Mongols were so successful at breaking down the old order that even when their empire eventually fragments and falls, the world can never quite return to what it was before. The Pax Mongolica, the bitter peace. Historians talk about the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For roughly a century, from about 1250 to 1350, the Mongol Empire created unprecedented stability across Eurasia. Trade flourished. The Silk Road was safer than it had been in centuries. Marco Polo could travel from Venice to China and back. Ideas and technologies spread between East and West. Paper money, gunpowder, the printing press. Innovations flowed across the empire. Some historians argue the Mongol Empire, despite its horrific origins, created the first truly globalized world. That it connected civilizations in ways that accelerated human progress. And if you're living in 1280, you might even start to believe it. The roads are safe, trade is good, your taxes are predictable. Maybe your grandfather's stories about the terror seem like ancient history. But here's what you need to understand. This peace was built on mass graves. The stability came from breaking entire civilizations so thoroughly they couldn't resist anymore. The prosperity was only possible because millions of people died to create it. You're living in a peace built on the largest act of organized violence in human history up to that point. And that fact never really goes away, no matter how normal things seem. The disease vector. The peace becomes a weapon. Remember how I mentioned the Mongol trade routes spread diseases? Let's get specific about what that meant. In 1346, Mongol forces are besieging the trading port of Kaffa in Crimea. Plague breaks out in the Mongol camp. The Mongols, in one of history's earliest examples of biological warfare, catapult plague-infected corpses over the city walls. The Italian merchants in Kaffa flee back to Europe. They bring the plague with them. Within 5 years, the Black Death kills between 75 to 200 million people. Europe loses half its population. The Middle East is devastated. China's population drops by tens of millions. If you were born in 1320, you might have thought you'd missed the worst of the Mongol era. The conquests were your grandparents' generation. You're living in the relative stability of the Pax Mongolica. And then the plague arrives, traveling along roads the Mongols built, spread by the trade networks they created, weaponized by their military tactics. You survive the Mongol sword only to die from the Mongol peace. The interconnected world the Mongols created, the thing that enabled trade and cultural exchange, also enabled diseases to spread faster and farther than ever before. You couldn't escape to a remote village because there were no remote villages anymore. The whole world was connected, and death could travel from China to England in months. The collapse begins when empires fall. By 1350, the Mongol Empire is fragmenting. The different Khanate are fighting each other. The Yuan dynasty in China is facing massive rebellions. The Golden Horde in Russia is weakening. The plague has killed massive numbers of people, including many Mongol administrators and soldiers. If you're living through this period, you might think, finally, freedom. The occupiers are leaving. We can rebuild. But collapse is its own kind of horror. When centralized authority breaks down, local warlords fill the void. The safe roads become dangerous again. The trade networks collapse. The legal system disappears. Without Mongol tax collectors, there's also no one maintaining the infrastructure. Roads, bridges, irrigation systems. You wanted freedom from the Mongols, but what you get is chaos. And here's the cruel irony. Some people actually miss Mongol rule. At least under the empire, there was order. There was stability. You knew the rules. Now it's a free-for-all where whoever has the most soldiers takes whatever they want. In China, the transition from Mongol rule to the Ming dynasty involves decades of warfare. In Russia, the collapse of the Golden Horde leads to a power vacuum that takes centuries to fully resolve. In Persia and Central Asia, the post-Mongol period is marked by constant conflict between successor states. The Mongols broke the old order so completely that when they left, there was no structure to return to. Your civilization has to be rebuilt from scratch, and that process is violent and chaotic. The Timur temptation. When history repeats. Just when you think the nightmare is over, it starts again. In 1370, a new conqueror emerges. Timur, also known as Tamerlane. He claims descent from Genghis Khan and seeks to rebuild the empire. And he uses the exact same tactics. Cities that resist are massacred. Pyramids of skulls are erected. Populations are displaced. Terror is weaponized. If you're alive in 1390, you're watching your grandparents' horror story play out again. The tactics that traumatized an entire generation are being recycled. The cultural memory of Mongol conquest is so strong that Timur uses it deliberately. He wants people to remember what happened before, so they'll surrender faster. Between 1370 and 1405, Timur's campaigns kill an estimated 17 million people, about 5% of the world's population at that time. You thought you were living in the post-Mongol world, learning to recover. But you're actually living in a world where Mongol-style conquest has become the template. Other conquerors have learned the lesson. Total warfare works. Terror works. Calculated genocide achieves strategic objectives. The Mongol legacy isn't just what they did. It's what they taught others was possible. The long-term impact. Centuries of consequences. Let's jump forward and look at the lasting effects, because this helps explain why being born during Genghis Khan's era cursed not just you, but your descendants for generations. Russia. The Mongol occupation of Russia, the Mongol yoke, lasts from the 1240s to 1480. Over 200 years of foreign rule. This experience shapes Russian political culture, military tactics, and even language. The word quarantine, comes from the Mongol system of isolating plague-infected areas. Russian autocracy partly develops as a response to and imitation of Mongol governance. The trauma of Mongol rule influences Russian geopolitics for centuries, creating a deep fear of invasion from the east. China. The Yuan dynasty, despite its eventual collapse, fundamentally changes Chinese political structure. The Mongols destroy the old examination system and the noble families. When the Ming dynasty restores Chinese rule, they can't restore the old order, it's gone. Chinese culture survives, but it's been disrupted at a fundamental level. Middle East. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 ends the Islamic Golden Age. The caliph is killed, breaking a line of succession going back to Muhammad. The Middle East never quite recovers its previous cultural and scientific prominence. The intellectual centers shift elsewhere. Centuries of accumulated knowledge are lost. Eastern Europe. The Mongol invasions devastate Poland, Hungary, and surrounding regions. They kill so many people that it takes generations for populations to recover. But they also inadvertently save Western Europe. The Mongols withdraw because of succession disputes back home, not because they're defeated. Western European civilization survives partly through sheer luck. If you were born in 1220, the consequences of that timing ripple through centuries. Your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond all live in a world shaped by the trauma and transformation of your era. The memory problem, how history forgot. Here's something that would disturb you if you could see how history remembers this era. Many people don't. In the West, Genghis Khan is often reduced to a caricature, a barbarian conqueror, sometimes even romanticized as a military genius who built an empire. The sheer scale of civilian death is glossed over or forgotten. The systematic terror is mentioned but not dwelled upon. The generational trauma is rarely discussed. Popular culture focuses on the military campaigns, the strategy, the impressive coordination, not the 40 million dead. Part of this is distance. The Mongol conquests happened in Asia and Eastern Europe, regions whose histories are less familiar to Western audiences. Part of it is time. 800 years is long enough for horror to fade into abstract numbers. But part of it is that the Mongols left relatively few written records of their own perspective. Most of what we know comes from their victims' Chinese, Persian, Russian, and European sources. And even those often focus on the events rather than the individual human cost. If you lived through the Mongol era, if you watched your city burn, if you lost everyone you loved, it would be a bitter pill to know that centuries later, your suffering would be reduced to a few paragraphs in a history book. That your conqueror would be remembered as great. The unanswered questions. What could have been? Let's engage in some historical speculation. What would the world look like if the Mongol conquest never happened? The Chinese Song dynasty was on the verge of an industrial revolution. They had mechanical clocks, advanced metallurgy, proto-capitalism, early forms of the scientific method. If they'd continued without disruption, would they have industrialized centuries before Europe? The Islamic Golden Age was producing incredible advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Baghdad's House of Wisdom was one of the greatest intellectual centers ever created. If it hadn't been destroyed, would the Renaissance have happened in the Middle East instead of Europe? Russia might have developed more in line with Western Europe democratic institutions, commercial culture, connections to the Mediterranean world. Instead, centuries of Mongol rule pushed it in a different direction. These aren't just abstract questions. If you were born in 1200, your life represents a branching point in history. The potential you carried, the children you might have had, the ideas you might have contributed, all of that was erased or redirected by the Mongol conquests. 40 million individuals, each with their own potential, their own possible contributions to human civilization. The loss isn't just the people who died. It's everything they might have created, discovered, or built. It's the civilizations that might have flourished but were instead shattered. You weren't just living in a difficult time. You were living through the foreclosure of countless possible futures. The nameless millions. Imagining individual lives. History gives us numbers and dates and famous names. But let's do something different for this final section. Let's imagine specific people, real individuals who would have lived through this era, whose stories were never written down but who represent millions of similar experiences. Mei, Chinese farmer's daughter, born 1210. You're 21 when the Mongols invade your province. You're engaged to be married. Your father is a successful farmer, not wealthy but comfortable. You can read a little, which is unusual for a village girl. Your future seems secure. Then the Mongol army appears. Your village surrenders. The soldiers are actually disciplined. They don't rape or plunder randomly, but they take inventory of everything. Your father's best oxen are conscripted for the army. Your brother is taken as a laborer. Your wedding is postponed indefinitely, then canceled. Your fiancé's family decides they can't afford a marriage in these uncertain times. You're 23 and suddenly unmarriageable in your culture. 2 years later, a Mongol administrator comes through recruiting women to work in a military household. Your father has no choice, he needs the payment to survive. You're sent to a Mongol camp where you cook and clean for soldiers. You're not mistreated exactly. They don't beat you. You're fed. But you're also not free. You're property. Years pass. You watch girls younger than you arrive, work until they're used up, and disappear. You survive by being useful and invisible. You're 45 when the Yuan dynasty stabilizes. Your Mongol master dies and his son releases you. He's marrying and his wife wants her own servants. You return to your village. Your parents are dead. Your brother died fighting for the Mongols in Persia. Your village is half empty. You're a middle-aged woman with no family, no husband, no children. You live on charity, doing odd jobs, existing in the margins of a world that's moved on without you. You die at 62, unmarked and unmourned by anyone except perhaps a neighbor who felt sorry for you. Your story isn't dramatic. No great battles, no heroic resistance. Just a quiet life slowly crushed by historical forces beyond your control. And there were millions like you. Hassan, Persian scholar, born 1195. You're 25 and studying medicine in Nishapur when the Mongols arrive. You're part of the educated elite. Your father is a wealthy merchant. You've read Avicenna, studied geometry, and know 4 languages. When the Mongol army surrounds the city, you argue for surrender. You're a scholar, not a warrior. What's the point of dying for pride? Your father-in-law, a city elder, disagrees. He wants to fight. He wins the argument. When the city falls, you watch them kill your father-in-law. Your wife is taken. You never see her again. They separate the educated people and you're terrified. But then a Mongol officer asks if anyone knows medicine. You do. You're spared to treat Mongol soldiers. For 30 years, you serve the Mongol army as a physician. You travel from China to Eastern Europe. You see horrors that haunt your dreams. You treat men who've committed atrocities. You occasionally treat their victims when the Mongols bother to keep prisoners alive. You try to maintain your medical ethics. You treat everyone who comes to you. But you're complicit in a machine of conquest, and you know it. You write your observations in a hidden journal. Medical notes mostly, but also descriptions of what you've seen. You hide it, hoping someday someone will read it and understand what this era was really like. You die at 68, serving the Ilkhanate in Persia. Your journal is lost, perhaps destroyed, perhaps still buried somewhere, never found. Your medical knowledge, your observations, your witness to history lost with you. Yuri, Russian peasant, born 1230. You're born into a world already conquered. The Golden Horde controls everything you know. You've never seen your homeland free. You're a serf, farming land for a Russian prince who pays tribute to Mongol overlords. You get taxed twice, once by your prince, once by the Mongols. It's barely survivable. When you're 20, the Mongols come through recruiting soldiers for a campaign somewhere far away. They take your older brother. He never returns. You marry at 25. You have 4 children. 3 die in childhood, 1 from disease, 2 from starvation during a particularly hard winter after a Mongol tax collection leaves you with nothing. Your surviving son grows up angry. He talks about resistance, about fighting back. You beg him to be quiet. You've seen what happens to rebels, entire villages burned for one person's defiance. He doesn't listen. At 20, he joins a group planning to ambush Mongol tax collectors. They're caught. The Mongol response is swift and brutal. Your son is executed, and because the Mongol policy is collective punishment, they come for you too. You're 47 years old when they hang you alongside your son's body. Your wife watches. She'll live another 15 years, broken and alone. Your entire life, your labor, your hopes, your family existed only to feed an empire you never wanted that killed you for the crime of raising a son who dared to resist. Batar, Mongol soldier, born 1225. Wait, let's also consider what it was like to be a Mongol during this era, because not everyone born in the empire was a victim. You're born on the steppes. Your grandfather rode with Genghis Khan. Your father is a minor officer in the Mongol army. You grow up in a culture that values martial skill above everything. You're trained from childhood to ride, shoot, fight. You're good at it. You take pride in your skills. At 15, you join your first campaign. You're nervous but excited. This is what you've trained for your whole life. Then you see combat. It's not glorious. It's terrifying and chaotic. Men die screaming. You kill your first person, a young soldier not much older than you. You vomit afterward. But you adapt. You have to. And after a while, it becomes easier. Not easy, never easy, but possible. You participate in the siege of a city. You follow orders. Those orders include killing civilians. You tell yourself they resisted, that this is war, that you're just following policy. But some nights you can't sleep. You see the faces. You rise through the ranks. You're an officer by 30. You have a wife, children, you own land. By Mongol standards, you're successful. But you drink more than you should. And sometimes you wake up reaching for a weapon, panicked by nightmares you can't quite remember. You're 50 when you die not in battle, but from an infected wound that festers. As you're dying, you think about all the people you've killed. You wonder if there's an afterlife, and if so, what's waiting for you there? You're not a villain in your own story. You're a man doing what your culture demanded, what your survival required. But you're still part of a machine that killed millions. The empire wasn't just built on the suffering of the conquered. It also took a piece of the conquerors themselves. The inheritance. We still carry. Here's what I want you to understand as we approach the end. The Mongol era didn't just matter to the people who lived through it. It shaped the world you're living in right now. The geopolitical boundaries of Asia and Eastern Europe still reflect Mongol conquest patterns. The cultural traumas still echo in folk stories, in historical memory, in how nations see themselves. The global trading networks that eventually led to modern globalization, They were pioneered during the Pax Mongolica, the connection between East and West. The Mongols forced it into existence. The very idea that a small, organized force could conquer massive civilizations through superior strategy and willingness to use overwhelming violence? That's a lesson that every conqueror since has learned. European colonialism, with its systematic subjugation of indigenous populations, its calculated use of terror, its willingness to depopulate entire regions for economic benefit, all of that has echoes of Mongol tactics. The 20th century's experiments with totalitarian empire, with mass violence as policy, with industrial-scale death, none of that was invented by the Mongols, but they pioneered the concept that civilian populations could be systematically targeted for strategic purposes. We live in a world the Mongols helped create, not just geographically or politically, but conceptually. They showed what was possible, for better and for worse. Why it sucked. The final reckoning. So let's answer the question that started this video. Why did it suck to be born during the time of Genghis Khan? It wasn't just because war was happening. War always happened. It wasn't just because people died. People always died. It sucked because you were living through the invention of total war. The systematic application of terror as policy. The calculated destruction of entire civilizations. The weaponization of fear at a scale humanity had never seen before. It sucked because nowhere was safe. Not the cities with their high walls. Not the remote villages. Not the surrendered territories. Nowhere. It sucked because your choices were impossible. Resist and face annihilation. Surrender and lose your freedom. Collaborate and lose your soul. There was no good option. It sucked because even if you personally survived, you had to live with what you'd seen, what you'd lost, what you'd become. The trauma was inescapable. It sucked because the world you were born into was erased and replaced with something alien. The kingdoms, the cultures, the traditions, all gone or fundamentally changed. It sucked because you couldn't even die knowing your suffering mattered. The empire would continue. The conquest would go on. Your death was a footnote in a campaign log, a number in an estimated total, a nameless victim of history's largest act of organized violence. But here's the thing. People survived. Not everyone, obviously. Millions didn't. But some did. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, had children, passed on their stories. They endured. The Mongol Empire seemed invincible, eternal. But it wasn't. It fragmented, collapsed, faded into history. The conquered civilizations outlasted their conquerors. If you were born in 1220, your life was hell. But your great-great-grandchildren would live in a world where the Mongols were memory, not reality. The terror passed, the trauma remained, but life continued. That's not much comfort if you're the one living through it. But it's something. The modern parallel. Why this still matters. I want to end with why this history is more than just a horror story from the past. We live in an era of unprecedented peace. The percentage of people who die in wars is lower than at any point in human history. The international system, however flawed, generally prevents the kind of total conquest we've been discussing. But that system is fragile. It depends on institutions, norms, and collective memory. When we forget what humans are capable of, when we forget how quickly civilization can collapse, when we forget the price of unchecked conquest, that's when we become vulnerable to history repeating. The Mongol era teaches us several things. First, small, organized, ruthless groups can defeat much larger populations if they're willing to go further than their opponents. Superior organization beats superior numbers. Second, terror works in the short term. The Mongols proved you can conquer through fear. But the long-term costs are catastrophic. The destroyed societies, the generational trauma, the cultural loss, these things echo for centuries. Third, civilization is fragile. The great Islamic centers of learning, gone in a generation. The Chinese dynasties, overthrown, the sophisticated societies of Central Asia erased. What seems permanent can vanish shockingly quickly. Fourth, individual lives matter, even when history treats them as statistics. Every one of those 40 million deaths was a person. Someone's child, parent, spouse, friend. Someone with hopes and fears and dreams. Numbers make us forget that. We can't let ourselves forget. Fifth, recovery is possible, but it's slow and incomplete. The world after the Mongols was different from the world before. You can rebuild, but you can't return to what was lost. The final answer. What we learn. If you were born during the time of Genghis Khan, you were born into an era that would test the absolute limits of human endurance. You'd face challenges that would break most people. You'd witness horrors that would haunt you forever. You'd lose almost everything that made life worth living. And yet, somehow, you'd probably keep going. Because that's what humans do. We survive. We adapt. We endure. The people of the 13th century weren't stronger than us. They weren't braver or more resilient. They were just people confused, scared, trying to protect their families, hoping for a better future. But they lived through something we can barely imagine, and most of them didn't give up. They kept farming, kept trading, kept having children, kept telling stories, kept believing that tomorrow might be better than today. That's the real lesson of the Mongol era. Not that humans can be monstrously cruel, we already knew that. But that humans can endure monstrous cruelty and still remain human. If you made it through the Mongol conquests, you earned your place in history. Even if history never wrote down your name. Even if no one remembers you existed. You were there, you survived, you mattered. And 8 centuries later, we're still here, telling your story. That's your victory. Not over the Mongols, they won the battles and conquered the territory. But you outlasted them. Your civilization, in some form, survived. The Mongol Empire fell. The people endured. And that's as close to a happy ending as the 13th century gets. Closing. We've covered 2 hours of history, but we've barely scratched the surface. The Mongol era was vast and complex, full of individual stories we'll never know, horrors we can't fully comprehend, and consequences we're still living with. If you're wondering whether being born in the 13th century was the worst possible time in human history, the answer is, it's definitely in the running. The combination of scale, sophistication, and sheer ruthlessness made the Mongol conquests uniquely terrible. But remember, every person born during that era was just trying to live their life. They didn't ask to be born into history's largest empire. They didn't volunteer to be part of a continental-scale catastrophe. They were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the next time you're having a bad day, remember, at least you're not hearing hoofbeats outside your city walls, knowing that the most terrifying army in human history has decided your city is next. That's it. That's why it sucked to be born during the time of Genghis Khan.